the judge among disputants. The sergeant stepped forward and assumed a posture of authority. Glanton spat. The judge had already crossed the space between them, and now he took the sergeant aside and fell to conversing with him. The sergeant came to his armpit, and the judge spoke warmly and gestured with a great expansiveness of spirit. The soldiers squatted in the dust with their muskets and regarded the judge without expression. "Don't you give that son of a bitch no money," said Glanton. But the judge was already bringing the man forward for a formal presentation. "Le presento al Sargento Aguilar," he called, hugging the ragged militant to him. The sergeant held out his hand quite gravely. It occupied that space and the attention of all who stood there, like something presented for validation, and then Speyer stepped forward and took it. "Mucho gusto." "Igualmente," said the sergeant. The judge escorted him from one to the next of the company, the sergeant formal and the Americans muttering obscenities or shaking their heads silently. The soldiers squatted on their heels and watched each movement in this charade with the same dull interest, and at length the judge hove up before the black. That dark, vexed face. He studied it, and he drew the sergeant forward, the better for him to observe, and then he began a laborious introduction in Spanish. He sketched for the sergeant a problematic career of the man before them, his hands drafting with a marvelous dexterity the shapes of what varied paths conspired here in the ultimate authority of the extant, as he told them, like strings drawn together through the eye of a ring. He adduced for their consideration references to the children of Ham, the lost tribes of Israelites, certain passages from the Greek poets, anthropological speculations as to the proportion of the races in their dispersion and isolation through the agency of geological cataclysm, and an assessment of racial traits with respect to climatic and geographical influences. The sergeant listened to this and more with great attention, and when the judge was done, he stepped forward and held out his hand. Jackson ignored him. He looked at the judge. "What did you tell him, Holden?" "Don't insult him, man." "What did you tell him?" The sergeant's face had clouded. The judge took him about the shoulders and leaned and spoke into his ear, and the sergeant nodded and stepped back and saluted the black. "What did you tell him, Holden?" "That shaking hands was not the custom in your land." "Before that, what did you say to him before that?" The judge smiled. "It is not necessary," he said, "that the principals here be in possession of the facts concerning their case, for their acts will ultimately accommodate history with or without their understanding. But it is consistent with notions of right principle that these facts, to the extent that they can be made readily to do so, should find a repository in the witness of some third party. Sergeant Aguilar is just such a party, and any slight to his office is but a secondary consideration when compared to divergences in that larger protocol exacted by the formal agenda of an absolute destiny. Words are things. The words he is in possession of, he cannot be deprived of. Their authority transcends his ignorance of their meaning. The black was sweating. A dark vein in his temple pulsed like a fuse. The company had listened to the judge in silence. A few smiled. A half-witted killer from Missouri guffawed softly like an asthmatic. The judge turned again to the sergeant, and they spoke together. And the judge and he crossed to where the crate stood in the courtyard, and the judge showed him one of the pistols and explained its workings with great patience. The sergeant's men had risen and stood waiting. At the gate, the judge doled coins into Aguilar's palm, and he shook hands formally with each ragged charge and complimented them upon their military bearing, and they exited into the street.